The chandelier above my head sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars, each crystal catching the California sunset streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Bennett estate. I stood in the corner of the grand ballroom holding a glass of champagne I had no intention of drinking, watching my brother Michael command the room like he always did. Broke and old. Those 2 words would haunt me for the rest of my life, except they wouldn't haunt me in the way Michael intended. They would become the kindling for something he never saw coming. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Emily Harper. I was 33 years old on the night of my brother's engagement party, and I had spent the better part of my adult life building something from nothing while my family pretended I didn't exist. The Bennett estate sat on a hill overlooking Newport Beach, the kind of property that whispered old money and screamed exclusivity. White-jacketed servers glided between clusters of guests offering hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. A string quartet played something classical in the corner, though nobody seemed to be listening. I had driven down from Seattle that morning, a 7-hour journey I made in silence, preparing myself for what I knew would be an exercise in emotional endurance. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, addressed formally to Ms. Emily Harper, as if I were a distant acquaintance rather than the groom's only sister. No phone call, no text, just a cream-colored envelope with embossed gold lettering announcing the engagement of Michael David Harper to Olivia Catherine Bennett. The Bennetts were old California money, the kind of family that had streets named after their ancestors and donated wings to hospitals. Olivia was their only daughter, a 28-year-old socialite who had never worked a day in her life and saw no reason to start. She was beautiful in that polished, manufactured way that required teams of professionals to maintain. Her engagement ring, a 5-carat diamond that caught the light every time she moved her hand, probably cost more than my first 3 years of rent combined. I had dressed simply for the occasion. A navy blue dress I had designed myself, understated and elegant, the kind of piece that whispered rather than shouted. My dark hair was pulled back in a low chignon, and I wore the small pearl earrings my grandmother had left me before she left us. I hadn't wanted to draw attention to myself. I never did at family gatherings. But attention found me anyway. My mother, Linda Harper, spotted me across the room and made her way over with the determined stride of a woman on a mission. She was 62, still handsome in that severe Midwestern way, her silver hair cut in a practical bob that hadn't changed in 20 years. She wore a champagne-colored dress that probably cost twice what mine did, though mine was infinitely better designed. "Emily," she said my name like a statement of fact rather than a greeting. "I didn't think you'd actually come. You invited me. Your father thought we should, for appearances." She glanced around the room, cataloging who might be watching us interact. The Bennetts have very traditional values. Family is important to them. I wanted to laugh at the irony, but kept my expression neutral. Family. As if the Harpers had ever treated me like I was part of one. "Where's Dad?" "Talking to Edward Bennett about the merger. Very important business." She lowered her voice. "Try not to embarrass us tonight, Emily. These are important people." Before I could respond, she had already turned away, migrating toward a cluster of women in designer dresses who were admiring Olivia's ring for what must have been the 100th time. I took a sip of my champagne, the bubbles doing nothing to settle the familiar knot in my stomach. This was always how it went. Michael was the golden child, the son who could do no wrong, who had joined our father's commercial real estate firm straight out of college and climbed the ladder with the effortless ease of someone who had the ladder built specifically for him. I was the afterthought, the creative one, the daughter who had disappointed everyone by refusing to follow the prescribed path. My father, Richard Harper, was holding court near the bar with Edward Bennett and a group of men in suits that cost more than most people's cars. He was 65, distinguished in that way, successful men often are with silver hair and the confident posture of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. He hadn't greeted me when I arrived, hadn't even looked in my direction. I was invisible to them. I had always been invisible to them. Aunt Carol appeared at my elbow, her arrival as unwelcome as a cold draft. She was my mother's sister, a woman who had never married and channeled all her unfulfilled ambitions into criticizing others. She wore too much perfume and not enough kindness. "Emily, honey." She looked me up and down with the practiced eye of someone searching for flaws. "Still renting apartments in Seattle. I own a townhouse, actually." "Oh." She didn't hide her disappointment. "Well, I suppose that's something, though it must be so lonely up there all by yourself. No husband, no children." She sighed dramatically. "Your mother worries about you, you know. We all do." I wondered what they would say if they knew the truth. If they knew about the company I had built from nothing, the designs that had been featured in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, the investors who had valued my business at figures that would make Aunt Carol's head spin. But I had kept that part of my life separate from them, a protective barrier between who I was and who they thought I was. "I'm fine, Aunt Carol, really. If you say so, dear." She patted my arm with false sympathy. "Just remember, it's never too late to settle down, though at your age you might have to lower your standards a bit." She drifted away before I could respond, leaving me alone with my champagne and my thoughts. The evening wore on, each hour feeling longer than the last. I made small talk with strangers, nodded politely when people asked what I did for a living, and told them I was in fashion, without elaborating, and tried to ignore the way my family treated me like a piece of furniture that clashed with the decor. Then Michael took the stage. He was 36, 3 years older than me, with the same dark hair and blue eyes we had inherited from our father. But where I had used those features to fade into the background, Michael wore them like a crown. He had a presence, the kind that made people lean in when he spoke, that made them laugh at jokes that weren't particularly funny and agree with opinions that weren't particularly well informed. "Everyone, if I could have your attention." He tapped a knife against his champagne glass, the sound cutting through the murmur of conversation. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward the small stage that had been set up near the band. Olivia joined him, her white dress glittering under the lights, her smile perfect and practiced. They looked like a magazine cover, the very picture of golden couple privilege. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate our engagement." Michael continued, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Olivia and I are so grateful to have you share in our happiness." Applause rippled through the crowd. I clapped along, my movements automatic. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge some special people," Michael said. "First, my incredible parents, Richard and Linda Harper. Mom, Dad, thank you for everything you've done for me. I wouldn't be the man I am today without you." More applause. My parents beamed, accepting the recognition as their due. "And of course the Bennett family. Edward, Margaret, thank you for welcoming me into your family and for raising such an amazing daughter." The Bennetts nodded graciously, their approval evident in their pleased expressions. "Now, before we get too sentimental, I want to have a little fun." Michael's tone shifted, taking on that playful edge that always made me nervous. "As you all know, we've been planning this wedding for months. Olivia has been working tirelessly with the wedding planner to make sure every detail is perfect." Olivia laughed, a musical sound that seemed rehearsed. "He's being modest. Michael has opinions about everything." The crowd chuckled appreciatively. "One of the things we've been discussing," Michael continued, "is the wedding party. Olivia has already chosen her bridesmaids, of course. All beautiful, successful women who reflect the kind of image we want for our special day." Something cold settled in my chest. I knew what was coming. I could feel it in the way Michael's eyes scanned the room, seeking me out in the crowd. "And I know some of you might be wondering about my side of the family, about whether my dear sister Emily might be part of the celebration." He found me. Our eyes met across the ballroom, and I saw the glint of malice that had always lurked beneath his charming exterior. "Well, I have to be honest with you all." He laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Our bridesmaid lineup is very particular, very curated, and Emily, well..." He shrugged with exaggerated helplessness. "She's a bit too old for the look we're going for, too broke to fit in with the crowd. No offense, sis, but maybe we should find someone prettier." The room erupted in laughter. I stood frozen, the champagne glass cold against my palm as the sound washed over me. My parents were laughing. Aunt Carol was smirking. Even strangers who didn't know me were chuckling at my expense, their amusement fueled by Michael's confident delivery and the assumption that he must be joking. But he wasn't joking. I knew him well enough to recognize the difference. Someone near me was holding up their phone recording the moment for social media. In a few hours, this would be on TikTok, my humiliation preserved forever in digital format. I raised my glass. To love. I said, my voice steady, despite the chaos inside me. A few people near me looked surprised, probably expecting tears or an angry outburst. Instead, I smiled a genuine smile that had nothing to do with the performance happening on stage. Because in my clutch, I could feel the weight of my phone, and in my inbox sat an email from Time magazine. An email that would change everything. Michael was still laughing, basking in the approval of the crowd, completely unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to shatter. I had come to this party expecting nothing but pain. What I hadn't expected was the opportunity to show everyone exactly who Emily Harper really was. 2 weeks before the engagement party, I had been in my office in Seattle watching rain streak down the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Pioneer Square. Harper Atelier occupied the top 2 floors of a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and industrial beams softened by the elegant displays of my designs. The space had been featured in Architectural Digest the previous year, though my family had no idea. My assistant, Stacy Chen, knocked on the doorframe. Her expression caught somewhere between excitement and disbelief. "You need to see this." I looked up from the fabric swatches spread across my desk designs for our upcoming fall collection that had been consuming my attention for months. Stacy had been with me since the beginning when Harper Atelier was just a dream and a handful of designs sewn in my one-bedroom apartment. She was more than an assistant now. She was my creative partner, my best friend, and the only person who truly understood the gap between who I was and who my family thought I was. "What is it?" She handed me her tablet. The screen opened to an email. The sender was a name I recognized immediately, a senior editor at Time magazine. I read the message twice, certain I was misunderstanding. "This is real." Stacy nodded, her dark eyes bright with barely contained excitement. "I already confirmed with their PR team. They're doing a special feature on the 100 most influential and successful women of the year. Business leaders, artists, activists." She paused for effect. "And you're on the list." I set the tablet down carefully, my hands suddenly unsteady. The email detailed the feature, which would include not just professional accomplishments, but personal net worth impact metrics and cultural influence. It mentioned the upcoming launch, the photo shoot they wanted to schedule, the interview they hoped to conduct. "They want to feature Harper Atelier in their best dressed section as well," Stacy continued. "Your designs on the best dressed list and you on the most influential women list. Emily, do you understand what this means?" I understood. I understood that everything I had built in secret away from my family's judgment and dismissal was about to become very public. Harper Atelier had started as a survival mechanism. After I moved to Seattle at 22 alone and essentially disowned for refusing to work at my father's company, I had taken a job at a small boutique while teaching myself design at night. I had no formal training, no connections, no family money to fall back on. What I had was determination and a vision I couldn't shake. The first collection had been modest, 20 pieces all handmade sold at a craft fair in Capitol Hill. They had sold out in 3 hours. The second collection, twice as large, sold out even faster. By the time I was 26, I had a small storefront. By 28, I had investors interested in expanding. By 30, Harper Atelier was a recognized name in the American fashion industry, known for designs that combined classic elegance with unexpected details. But I had kept it all secret from my family. Not because I was ashamed, because they had made it clear again and again that nothing I did would ever be good enough. When I had called home at 24 to tell them about my first boutique, my mother had asked when I was going to get a real job. When I had mentioned at Christmas dinner 5 years ago that my business was growing, my father had changed the subject to Michael's latest promotion. When Vogue had featured my work for the first time, I hadn't even bothered to tell them. What was the point? So I had built my empire in silence, letting them believe I was still the struggling creative they expected me to be. I had stopped asking for their approval and started giving it to myself instead. and now Time magazine wanted to tell the world about it. "The launch is in 3 weeks," Stacy said, pulling me from my thoughts. "They're planning a big reveal, cover story, social media campaign, the whole thing." 3 weeks. I did the mental math and felt something shift in my chest. Michael's engagement party is in 2 weeks. Stacy's expression changed, understanding dawning. She knew about my family. I had told her everything over late nights in the office and tear-filled conversations after particularly painful holiday visits. She knew about the favoritism, the dismissal, the constant message that I was somehow less than. "You're going to the party." They invited me, sort of. I pulled the cream-colored invitation from my desk drawer where it had been sitting since it arrived. I wasn't going to go, but now you have options. Stacy's voice was careful, testing the waters. "The Time feature isn't public yet. It won't be announced until after the party, which means you could show up as the Emily they expect and leave as someone else entirely." We looked at each other, years of friendship, allowing us to communicate without words. Stacy had seen me cry after family gatherings. She had held me while I processed the latest rejection, the newest proof that I would never be good enough for the Harpers. She had also seen me build something extraordinary, had watched me transform from a scared young woman with a sewing machine into a business owner whose net worth now exceeded anything my father had ever achieved. "What are you thinking?" she asked. I thought about all the times I had stayed silent, all the dinners where I had smiled through the pain, nodded through the insults, pretended that their words didn't cut. I thought about the Christmas I was 16, when Michael got a car and I got a lecture about my grades. I thought about my high school graduation, which my parents had almost missed because Michael had a lacrosse game. I thought about the day I moved to Seattle when my mother had told me I was making a mistake I would regret forever. "I'm thinking," I said slowly, "that I've spent my whole life letting them define me, and I'm tired." Stacy smiled, the expression fierce and proud. "So what do you want to do?" "I want to go to that party. I want to wear something simple, something that won't draw attention. I want to be exactly who they expect me to be." I picked up the tablet again, rereading the email from Time. "And then I want them to find out the truth." "How?" I thought for a moment. "Can you get me a USB drive with the Time feature, the draft, the photos, everything?" "Probably. The editor mentioned wanting your input before the final version goes live." Stacy's eyes widened as she realized what I was planning. "Emily, are you serious? They're going to project photos at the party. Olivia mentioned it in the invitation. A slideshow of Michael and his accomplishments, their relationship timeline, all that." I felt something unfamiliar rising in my chest, a mixture of anticipation and resolve. "What if someone added to that slideshow?" Stacy laughed. The sound startled and delighted. "You're going to hijack their projection. I'm going to give them a show they'll never forget." And we spent the next hour planning. Stacy would coordinate with Time to get the advanced materials. I would reach out to a friend who did AV work, someone who could help me ensure the technical side went smoothly. The USB would contain not just the announcement of my inclusion on the list, but selected photos from my career, from the early days in my tiny apartment to the current state of Harper Atelier's flagship store. It wasn't revenge, I told myself. It was true. But as I drove to California 2 weeks later, the USB tucked safely in my clutch, I couldn't deny the flutter of something darker in my chest. All those years of silence, of acceptance, of letting them treat me like I was nothing. Part of me wanted them to hurt the way I had hurt. Part of me wanted them to finally see what they had missed. The drive gave me time to think, to remember. Edgewood, Washington, where I had grown up, was a small suburban town east of Seattle. Our house had been nice, but not extravagant. My father's success still building in those years. Michael and I had shared a room until I was 8, and even then I had been aware of the difference in how our parents treated us. Michael got new clothes for school. I got hand-me-downs from cousins. Michael got tutors when he struggled with math. I was told to work harder when I struggled with anything. Michael got praise for mediocrity. I got criticism for excellence. By high school, the pattern was set. Michael was the star, the athlete, the popular kid who dated cheerleaders and won homecoming king. I was the quiet one, the creative one, the girl who spent her free time sketching designs instead of going to parties. When Michael got accepted to USC on a partial scholarship that my father topped up without complaint, I had worked 3 jobs to pay my own way through community college before transferring to Washington State. The disparity had never made sense to me. We were both their children. We had both been born into the same family, raised in the same house, loved by the same parents. Except they hadn't loved us the same. They hadn't loved me at all, I sometimes thought. They had simply tolerated me until I was old enough to leave. By the time I reached the Bennett estate, the sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. I sat in my rental car for several minutes, watching guests arrive in their luxury vehicles, steeling myself for what lay ahead. My phone buzzed. A text from Stacy. "Everything is ready. The AV guy is set up inside. Just give him the signal." I looked at the USB in my clutch. Such a small thing to carry so much weight. Then I took a deep breath, opened the car door, and stepped into the evening that would change everything. The Bennett estate had been designed to impress, and it succeeded beyond measure. The main house was a Mediterranean-style mansion with white stucco walls and a terracotta roof, surrounded by manicured gardens that cascaded down the hillside toward the ocean. Valets in crisp uniforms took cars at the circular drive, directing guests toward the grand entrance where the hosts waited to greet arrivals. I joined the queue, smoothing my navy dress and reminding myself to breathe. The couple in front of me, dressed in designer labels that shouted their price tags, glanced back and dismissed me in a single look. I was used to that. My dress, though exquisitely made, didn't announce its value. That was the point. Margaret Bennett stood at the door, elegant in silver silk, her smile precisely calibrated to convey warmth without intimacy. Edward Bennett was beside her, distinguished in a dark suit, shaking hands and making small talk with the practiced ease of a man who had been hosting such events his entire life. "Welcome, welcome." Margaret's smile faltered slightly when she reached me, clearly trying to place who I was. "And you are Emily Harper, Michael's sister." "Oh." The word contained volumes. "Yes, of course. Michael mentioned you might come." She said it like it was a surprise, like my attendance at my own brother's engagement party was somehow unexpected or unwelcome. I smiled politely and moved inside, leaving her to greet the next guests. The ballroom was even more impressive than the exterior had suggested. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, casting prismatic light across walls covered in silk damask. A live band played soft jazz in one corner, while servers circulated with trays of champagne and canapes. An ice sculpture of intertwined hearts sat on a table near the bar, slowly melting into a pool of artistic pretension. I estimated there were perhaps 200 guests, a carefully curated collection of society families, business associates, and beautiful people whose primary qualification seemed to be looking good in photographs. Large screens had been set up around the room, currently displaying a looping slideshow of Michael and Olivia's relationship, photo after photo of perfect moments captured for social media. Emily. I turned to find Olivia approaching her white dress, catching the light with every movement. Up close, she was even more polished than she had appeared from a distance, every hair in place, every nail perfectly manicured. She looked at me the way one might examine a piece of furniture that had been left in the wrong room. "Olivia, congratulations on your engagement." "Thank you." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm so glad you could make it. Michael wasn't sure you would come." "I wouldn't miss it." "No, I suppose not." She glanced at my dress, her expression flickering with something that might have been disapproval. "That's an interesting choice. Did you make it yourself?" "I did, actually." "How crafty." The word was a dismissal, a polite way of saying homemade and therefore inferior. "Well, enjoy the party. There's plenty of food and the bar is open. I'm sure you'll find something to keep you busy." She drifted away before I could respond, joining a cluster of women who greeted her with air kisses and compliments about her ring. I watched her go, feeling the familiar ache of being found wanting without understanding why. The next few hours passed in a blur of awkward interactions and barely concealed contempt. My father nodded at me once, but didn't speak. My mother delivered her lecture about not embarrassing the family. Aunt Carol made her comments about my age and marital status. Strangers looked through me as though I were invisible, their attention reserved for people who mattered. I found a quiet corner near the windows and watched the sunset paint the ocean in shades of fire. In Seattle, my company was preparing for the biggest launch in its history. In Seattle, people respected me, admired my work, and sought my opinion. Here I was, nothing, less than nothing. My phone buzzed again, Stacy checking in. AV guy says he's ready whenever you are. Just give him the signal. I typed back a quick response, then tucked my phone away and rejoined the party. The mood had shifted as evening deepened into night. Guests had consumed enough champagne to loosen their inhibitions, and the conversations had grown louder, more animated. Someone had turned up the music, and a few couples were dancing in the space, cleared for that purpose. Then Michael took the stage. I had positioned myself near the front, close enough to see his expression, clearly close enough to watch the play of emotions across his face, when everything changed. He looked confident, triumphant, a man at the peak of his powers, celebrating another victory. He tapped his glass. The room fell silent. And then he said those words, "Too old, too broke. Find someone prettier." The laughter hit me like a wave, and for a moment I was 16 again, standing in our kitchen while my parents praised Michael for his lacrosse trophy and ignored the scholarship letter in my hands. I was 22, packing my car alone, while my mother watched from the window without coming out to say goodbye. I was every age I had ever been when they had made me feel small. But I wasn't small anymore. I raised my glass. To love. The words cut through the laughter, drawing confused looks from those nearby. Michael's smile flickered, uncertain. He had expected tears, I realized. He had expected me to run away humiliated, to provide the entertainment of watching his pathetic sister crumble. Instead, I walked toward the small table where the gifts were displayed, my heels clicking against the polished floor. From my clutch, I withdrew a small wrapped box and set it among the others. "A gift for the happy couple," I said loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I thought you might enjoy it." Olivia's curiosity got the better of her disdain. She approached the table, examining the box with skeptical interest. "What is it? Why don't you open it and find out?" She glanced at Michael, who shrugged and descended from the stage to join her. The crowd had gathered around, sensing entertainment watching, as Olivia carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a small velvet box. Inside the box was a USB drive. "What is this?" Michael's tone was dismissive. "Some kind of joke." "Not a joke." I smiled, and for the first time all evening, it was genuine. "A gift. Something I thought you'd want to share with all your guests." The room murmured with confusion. From the corner of my eye, I saw the AV technician Stacy had arranged waiting near the control panel for the projection system. "Go ahead," I said. "Play it." Michael looked at Olivia, who looked at her parents, who looked uncertain for the first time all evening. The pressure of the crowd's attention made the decision for them. Edward Bennett nodded to one of the staff members, who took the USB and inserted it into the projection system. The screens around the room flickered, and then my face appeared larger than life alongside the Time magazine logo and the headline that would change everything: the most influential and successful women of 2025. The room went silent. Chapter 4. The Truth Revealed. The photograph they had chosen for the feature was one from a session at Harper Atelier's flagship store, taken against a backdrop of my designs. I wore one of my own creations, a burgundy gown that had been featured in Vogue the previous year, and looked directly into the camera with the confidence of someone who had built an empire. The slideshow continued, automatically revealing more details. My name, my company, the valuation that made me one of the wealthiest self-made women in the Pacific Northwest, the list of celebrities who had worn my designs, the features in major publications, the partnerships with luxury retailers across the country. I watched as the faces around me transformed, shock replacing smugness, confusion replacing contempt. My mother's champagne glass trembled in her hand. My father stood rigid, his expression unreadable. Michael stared at the screens as though watching something impossible, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning fog. "This is—" Olivia trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Real," I finished for her. "Every word of it." The murmuring started, then spreading through the crowd like ripples in a pond. I heard fragments of conversation, snippets of disbelief and recalculation. Harper Atelier, the fashion house. I had no idea she was— "Did you see the valuation more than Edward Bennett's company? That burgundy gown she's wearing in the photo, that was what Jennifer Lawrence wore to the Golden Globes." The last comment spoken by a young woman near the bar seemed to break the spell. Suddenly, people were looking at me differently, their expressions shifting from dismissal to interest, from contempt to something approaching respect. Michael found his voice first. "Why didn't you tell us?" The question was almost funny. Almost. If I had been capable of finding humor in anything that night, I might have laughed at the absurdity of it. He had just publicly humiliated me, called me old and broke and ugly in front of 200 people. And now he wanted to know why I hadn't shared my success with him. "Would you have listened?" The words hung in the air between us, heavy with years of accumulated pain. Michael opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently unable to find an answer. "I've told you things before." I continued, my voice steady, despite the trembling in my hands. "I told Mom about my first boutique. She asked when I was going to get a real job. I told Dad about my first major sale. He changed the subject to your promotion. I mentioned that my business was growing at Christmas dinner 5 years ago, and no one even responded." The crowd had gone silent now, watching the family drama unfold, with the rapt attention of an audience at a play. Someone was definitely recording this on their phone. Tomorrow it will be everywhere. "You decided a long time ago that I was nothing," I said. "So I stopped trying to prove otherwise. I built my company, my life, my success without you. And you know what? It was easier that way. Easier than constantly hoping you might someday be proud of me and constantly being disappointed." "Emily." My mother stepped forward, her composure cracking. "We had no idea. If we had known— If you had known what— You would have treated me like I mattered." I shook my head. "You should have treated me like I mattered because I'm your daughter, not because I'm successful." The words came out more bitter than I intended, but I didn't take them back. They were true. They had always been true. "This is ridiculous." Michael's voice had an edge of desperation. "You can't just show up here and make a scene because you're feeling left out. This is my engagement party, my night, and you're trying to make it all about you." "I didn't make a scene. You did. You stood up on that stage and humiliated me in front of everyone here. You called me old and broke and suggested I wasn't pretty enough to be in your wedding." I met his eyes, seeing the man he had always been beneath the charm and confidence. "All I did was tell the truth. A truth you kept secret for years." Michael's voice rose, his composure slipping. "While you were letting us think you were struggling, you were actually building some kind of empire that's manipulative, that's dishonest. Is it," I asked quietly, "or is it just the natural result of being dismissed so completely that I stopped trying to share anything with you? You didn't know about my success because you never asked, you never cared, none of you did." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that falls when there's nothing left to say. Around us, the party had essentially stopped, guests frozen in place, watching the Harper family reckoning with years of dysfunction in real time. Edward Bennett cleared his throat, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. "Perhaps we should take a break. Give everyone a moment to collect themselves." It was a graceful exit, an attempt to salvage what remained of the evening's dignity. But the damage was done. The video on the screens had cycled back to the beginning, my face once again filling the displays, a constant reminder of everything my family had missed. I looked at Michael one last time, searching for some sign of understanding, some hint that this moment might lead to something different. but all I saw was anger and embarrassment, the fury of someone whose carefully constructed world had just crumbled around him. "Enjoy the rest of your party," I said. "I think I've overstayed my welcome." I turned and walked toward the exit, my heels clicking against the polished floor, feeling the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on my back. No one tried to stop me. No one called out. The doors closed behind me with a soft click, and I stood alone on the terrace, breathing in the salt air and watching the moon rise over the Pacific. My phone buzzed. Stacy. "I'm watching the live stream. Holy shit, Emily. Are you okay?" I typed back slowly, my fingers unsteady. "I don't know. Maybe." That was the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do. "The comments are going crazy. People are calling you a legend." I looked back at the mansion lights spilling from the windows, the sound of confused conversation filtering through the glass. Inside, my family was probably trying to figure out what had just happened, how their carefully planned evening had gone so spectacularly wrong. For a moment, I felt a flash of something that might have been regret. They were still my family after all, despite everything. Was this really what I wanted? To burn down whatever remained of our relationship in the most public way possible? But then I remembered Michael's words. "Too old. Too broke. Find someone prettier." Said with a smile, received with laughter recorded for posterity. He had tried to destroy me tonight to cement my position as the family failure in front of everyone who mattered to him. I had simply refused to let him. My car was waiting where I had left it, undisturbed by the drama inside. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the Bennett estate without looking back. Tomorrow, the world would know what had happened. Tomorrow, I will have to deal with the aftermath, the media attention, and the family fallout. Tonight, I just wanted to go home. As the lights of Newport Beach faded in my rearview mirror, I realized that something had fundamentally shifted, not just in how my family saw me, but in how I saw myself. For 33 years, I had been trying to earn their approval, adjusting myself to fit their expectations, shrinking to accommodate their limitations. That was over now. Whatever came next, I would face it as myself, not as the person they wanted me to be, not as the quiet, invisible sister who accepted whatever treatment they deemed appropriate. Just Emily Harper, fashion designer, business owner, self-made success. It was enough. It was enough. I always have been. I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating itself off the nightstand, the persistent buzz of notifications that had apparently been building all night. Sunlight streamed through the windows of my Seattle townhouse, painting warm rectangles on the hardwood floor, indifferent to the chaos waiting for me in the digital world. The drive back had taken 12 hours, most of it spent in silence, processing what had happened. I had pulled over twice, once to cry, and once to call Stacy, who had talked me through a minor panic attack in the parking lot of a rest stop near Eugene. By the time I finally fell into bed, it was past 3 in the morning, and I had been too exhausted to even look at my phone. Now, blinking against the light, I reached for the device and watched as the notifications scrolled past faster than I could read them. Social media mentions text messages, voicemails, emails. The numbers kept climbing. I opened TikTok first, searching for my name with a mixture of dread and curiosity. The video had been viewed over 10 million times. Someone at the party had captured the entire exchange, from Michael's initial insult through the time reveal to my final confrontation. The clip had been edited and reposted countless times, set to different music overlaid with commentary dissected by people I had never met. Hashtags had formed around the moment, trending phrases like Time Magazine Revenge and Harper Atelier Queen that made me simultaneously proud and terrified. I scrolled through the comments, hundreds of thousands of them, overwhelmingly positive. Women sharing their own stories of family dismissal, of being underestimated, of rising, despite those who tried to hold them down. A few negative ones, too, people calling me petty or vindictive, suggesting I should have handled things privately. But they were drowned out by the wave of support. Stacy had sent roughly 40 texts overnight, a running commentary on the viral explosion that I had slept through. It's still growing. Every morning show is talking about it. CNN ran a segment. This is insane. The Harper Atelier website crashed from traffic. Our tech team is working on it. Vogue wants an exclusive interview. So does Harper's Bazaar, which is hilarious given their name. Your family has been trying to reach you. Ignore them for now. Let them stew. The last message had been sent at 2 a.m, and there were several more that followed, but I stopped reading. My family had been trying to reach me. Of course they had. I checked my voicemail, finding 17 new messages. 3 from numbers I didn't recognize, probably media outlets. The rest were familiar. My mother's voice tight with emotion. "Emily, we need to talk. Call me back, please." Michael angry. "What you did was completely inappropriate. You ruined our engagement party. I can't believe you would do something so selfish." My father cold and controlled. "This was a private family matter. You had no right to make it public. We'll discuss this further." Aunt Carol predictably dramatic. "Emily, your mother is beside herself. How could you do this to the family? On Michael's special night." I deleted them all without listening past the first few seconds of each. Their responses were exactly what I had expected: criticism and blame, and assumption that I was the one who had done something wrong. Not Michael, who had publicly humiliated me. Not my parents, who had laughed along. Me for having the audacity to respond. My phone rang. "Stacy, are you alive?" "Barely." I sat up against my pillows, still in the clothes I had been wearing when I collapsed into bed. "I just saw the numbers. It's insane. In a good way, mostly." Stacy paused, and I could hear the click of keys in the background. "We've had 43 partnership inquiries this morning. Our sales last night exceeded the previous month's total. Someone at Netflix left a message about adapting your story." Netflix. I know it's a lot, but Emily, this is also an incredible opportunity. You've been building Harper Atelier quietly for years, and now everyone knows who you are, what you've accomplished. This could be transformative. She was right, of course. From a business perspective, the viral moment was a gift. Exposure that would have cost millions in advertising, delivered for free by my brother's cruelty and my own refusal to accept it. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the final chapter of something I hadn't realized I was writing: the end of any possibility of a normal relationship with my family. "What do you want to do?" Stacy asked, her voice gentler now. "We can capitalize on this, or we can try to quiet things down. Your call." I thought about it, really thought, weighing the options. Part of me wanted to disappear to let the story fade while I returned to the comfortable anonymity I had built. But another part, the part that had stood up in that ballroom and refused to be diminished, wanted something different. "Let's do the interview with Vogue," I said finally. "But I want to control the narrative. This isn't going to be a revenge story. It's going to be about building something from nothing, about success that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval." "I can work with that. I'll reach out to their editor and set something up." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my bedroom watching dust motes drift through the sunlight. My phone continued to buzz with notifications, but I ignored it, giving myself a moment to exist in the space between what had happened and what would come next. The truth was, I hadn't planned for any of this. The USB had been an impulse, a moment of rebellion after years of compliance. I had wanted my family to know the truth, to see me as I really was, even if just for a moment. I hadn't anticipated that moment going viral, becoming a symbol for something larger than my personal drama. But here I was, and there was no going back. Over the next several hours, I showered, ate something that resembled breakfast, and began the slow process of responding to the most urgent messages. The Harper Atelier team was handling business communications, but there were personal notes that required my attention: friends and colleagues expressing support, industry contacts congratulating me, people I had lost touch with reaching back out. By late afternoon, I felt almost normal again, or at least a version of normal that included being internet famous. Stacy stopped by with coffee and a printed agenda of potential opportunities, and we spent 2 hours going through options, deciding what made sense and what felt exploitative. It was nearly 6 when my phone rang with a call I couldn't ignore. My mother. I stared at the screen for 3 rings, 4, 5. Stacy watched me, her expression carefully neutral. "You don't have to answer," she said. "I know." But I did anyway, stepping onto my small balcony where the evening light was turning golden and the city sounds provided a kind of buffer. "Emily?" My mother's voice was different than it had been in the voicemail, less angry, more exhausted. "Thank you for picking up." "What do you want?" A long pause. I could hear her breathing the soft sounds of the home I had grown up in, somewhere in the background. "I wanted to apologize." The words hung there unexpected and strange. In 33 years, I could count on one hand the number of times either of my parents had apologized to me for anything. And yet here it was offered across cellular signals like it was the most natural thing in the world. For what specifically? Another pause longer this time. For laughing. When Michael said those things, I should have stopped him or said something. Instead, I just went along with it like I always do. It wasn't enough. It wasn't close to enough. But it was something, a crack in the wall that had stood between us for decades. "Why did you?" I asked. "Why did you always go along with it?" "I don't know." Her voice cracked. "I've been thinking about that all night. Why I treated you differently. Why did we all do it? And I don't have a good answer. I wish I did." I looked out at the city, at the lights beginning to flicker on as evening settled in. Somewhere out there, millions of people had watched my family's dysfunction play out on their screens. They had opinions about us now, judgments formed in seconds, conclusions drawn from a single viral moment. But they didn't know what it felt like to be standing here, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my mother struggle with words that came far too late. "I don't know what you want me to say," I told her honestly. "I've spent my whole life trying to earn your approval, trying to be good enough, and I finally realized that it was never going to happen. Not because of anything I did wrong, but because you had decided who I was before I had a chance to become anyone. Emily, I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true, and I think if we're ever going to have any kind of real relationship, we have to start with the truth." Silence stretched between us, filled with years of things unsaid, opportunities missed, love that could have been, but wasn't. "I understand," my mother said finally, "and I know I can't fix this with a phone call, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that I saw the Time feature, the real one, not just the clips online." She paused. "I had no idea, Emily. The things you've accomplished, they're extraordinary. Thank you. I should have known. I should have asked. I should have been there." Her voice broke. "I failed you. As a mother, I failed you." The tears came then, unexpected and unwelcome, sliding down my cheeks while I gripped the balcony railing. I hadn't cried when Michael insulted me. I hadn't cried during the revelation or the confrontation or the long drive home, but hearing my mother acknowledge her failures even partially broke something loose inside me. "I have to go," I said, my voice thick. "But maybe we can talk again, when things have calmed down. I'd like that. I'd like that very much." I ended the call and stood there in the fading light, letting the tears fall, letting the grief of 33 years begin to work its way out. Stacy appeared in the doorway, took one look at my face, and crossed to pull me into a hug. "Whatever that was," she said, "you're going to be okay." I wasn't sure I believed her, but for the first time in a long time, I thought it might be possible. The weeks following the engagement party unfolded like a fever dream each day, bringing new developments that seemed impossible to process. Harper Atelier became a phenomenon, our website traffic increasing by 700%. Our waiting list growing so long we had to create new systems to manage them. The Time feature officially launched, and suddenly I was fielding requests from every major media outlet, podcast, and talk show in the country. I chose my opportunities carefully guided by Stacy's strategic mind and my own instincts about what felt authentic. The Vogue interview became a cover story, a thoughtful piece about building a brand without family support that resonated with women across the country. I appeared on a few carefully selected podcasts, always steering the conversation toward the work rather than the drama, though the drama inevitably came up. The narrative that emerged was surprisingly nuanced. Yes, people loved the revenge angle, the satisfying moment when the underestimated sister revealed herself to be more successful than anyone imagined. but they also connected with the deeper story, the years of dismissal, the determination to succeed, despite a lack of support, the complex emotions of wanting approval from people who would never give it. Emails poured in from women who saw themselves in my story. Daughters who had been overshadowed by brothers, creative spirits who had been told to get real jobs, first-generation business owners who had built empires while their families waited for them to fail. Each message reinforced something I had always known, but never fully believed I wasn't alone. The Harper family dysfunction was not unique. It was in many ways universal. The business opportunities that followed were staggering. Partnership offers from major retailers, investment inquiries that would have seemed like fantasies a year earlier, collaboration requests from designers whose work I had admired for years. Harper Atelier was no longer a well-kept secret. It was a legitimate force in American fashion. But success has a way of complicating things. My family continued to reach out, their approaches varying in tone and desperation. Michael left angry voicemails that gradually softened into something approaching regret. My father sent a formal email, stiff and uncomfortable, acknowledging that he had perhaps been too focused on business to properly appreciate my accomplishments. Aunt Carol predictably oscillated between criticism and attempts at reconciliation. I responded to none of them directly, though I asked Stacy to send polite acknowledgments to keep things civil. I wasn't ready for conversations that required more emotional energy than I had to spare. The business was demanding everything I had. It was nearly a month after the party when I finally agreed to see my mother again. She had asked repeatedly, her messages growing more vulnerable with each attempt, and something in me had shifted enough to allow for the possibility. We met at a small cafe in Capitol Hill, a neutral location far from the loaded geography of my childhood home or the professional environment of Harper Atelier. She looked older than I remembered, the stress of recent weeks, evident in new lines around her eyes and a tremor in her hands that hadn't been there before. "Thank you for meeting me," she said after we had ordered. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I." She nodded, accepting that. "I've been talking to someone, a therapist, since everything happened." She seemed embarrassed by the admission, which made sense given that the Harper family had never believed in asking for help with emotional problems. "She's been helping me understand some things about why I am the way I am." "And what have you understood?" My mother looked down at her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "I was raised to believe that daughters weren't as valuable as sons, not explicitly, but in 1,000 small ways. My mother always deferred to my father. My brothers got opportunities I was never offered. When I had Michael, I felt like I had finally done something right. And when I had you..." She trailed off, pain flickering across her face. "You didn't know what to do with me." "No, you were so different from what I expected. Creative, independent, unwilling to just go along with things. You challenged me without even trying, and instead of celebrating that, I resented it." The honesty was unexpected, almost shocking. My mother had never spoken to me this way, with this level of self-awareness and vulnerability. Whatever was happening in therapy, it was clearly having an effect. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Really? What do you hope will happen here?" "I want a chance to get to know you. The real you, not the idea of you I've been carrying around for 33 years. She met my eyes, and I saw something I had never seen before: genuine respect. "I watched your interview with Vogue, the way you talked about your company, your vision, your struggles. I realized I had never heard you talk that way, because I never gave you the space to." "You're right. You didn't. I can't change the past. I can't undo the damage I've done, but I can try to be different going forward, if you'll let me." I thought about all the times I had wanted exactly this: a mother who saw me, who valued me, who wanted to know who I really was. And now that it was being offered, I wasn't sure what to do with it. "I'm not ready to forget everything that happened," I said finally. "I'm not ready to pretend we're suddenly going to have this perfect relationship. Too much has happened for that." "I understand. But I'm willing to try, slowly, with boundaries, and with the understanding that if you fall back into old patterns, I will walk away without hesitation." My mother nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. That's more than I deserve. Maybe it was, but I had learned something in the weeks since the party, something important about the nature of healing. Holding on to anger felt righteous, but it was also exhausting. And while my family might never fully understand me, while the damage might never be completely repaired, there was something to be said for incremental progress over permanent estrangement. We talked for 2 more hours, covering territory we had never explored before. She asked about Harper Atelier, genuinely curious this time, and I found myself explaining my vision, my struggles, my dreams for the future. She shared stories from her own youth times when she had wanted things that didn't fit her prescribed role, times when she had swallowed those desires to meet expectations. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was something, a foundation that might eventually support more. As I drove back to my office afterward, I thought about the strange alchemy of public exposure. The viral moment that had destroyed any pretense of normalcy had also in some ways created space for honesty. My family could no longer pretend they didn't know about my success, and I could no longer hide behind that ignorance, using it as a shield against the vulnerability of real connection. The road forward was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt like there might actually be a road at all. Sometimes to understand where you're going, you have to remember where you've been. In the quiet moments between interviews and meetings, between the chaos of viral fame and the daily demands of running a company, I found myself thinking about the girl I used to be. Edgewood, Washington was the kind of town that prided itself on normalcy. Tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, the steady rhythm of suburban life. The Harper family fit in perfectly, at least from the outside. Nice house, 2 cars, 2 children. The American dream in its most conventional form. But inside that house, the story was more complicated. Michael was born when my parents were young and optimistic, their marriage new, their resources limited, but growing. By the time I came along 3 years later, things had changed. My father's real estate business was taking off, consuming more of his time and attention. My mother had settled into a pattern of deference that would define the rest of her life. I was the second child, but more than that, I was the wrong kind of child. Where Michael was athletic, I was artistic. Where he was confident, I was questioning. Where he thrived in structure, I chafed against it. Every personality test, every parent-teacher conference, every family dinner confirmed what my parents had already concluded. Michael was the one to watch, the one to invest in, the one who would carry the Harper name forward. I learned early to expect less. Birthdays were smaller affairs for me. Christmas gifts, slightly more practical attention, allocated based on a calculus I didn't fully understand but felt acutely. When Michael made the varsity lacrosse team, there was a party. When I won a statewide art competition, there was a brief acknowledgement over dinner before the conversation moved on. The turning point came when I was 15. Michael had wrecked his car, a graduation gift from our parents that had cost more than a year's worth of my future college tuition. He was fine physically, but the car was totaled. My parents' response had been concern for his emotional state, worry about whether the accident would affect his college applications. That same week, I had asked for money to attend a summer design program at a prestigious art school. The cost was a fraction of what the car repairs would have been. "We can't afford that right now," my mother had said, not meeting my eyes. "Maybe next year." There was no next year. There never was. I started working at 16, first at a coffee shop, then at a boutique where my eye for design caught the owner's attention. By the time I graduated high school, I had saved enough to cover my own community college tuition and had learned something valuable: no one was going to give me anything. If I wanted a future, I would have to build it myself. Those early years in Seattle were hard in ways I rarely talked about. I lived in a studio apartment so small I could touch opposite walls with my arms outstretched. I ate rice and beans for weeks at a time, rationing protein like currency. I worked 3 jobs while taking classes, falling asleep over textbooks, waking before dawn to sew samples of designs that existed only in my imagination. But I was free. For the first time in my life, I was completely and entirely free. The first collection came together in that tiny apartment, each piece hand-stitched on a secondhand sewing machine that broke down so often I learned to repair it myself. 20 designs ranging from simple day dresses to an evening gown that had taken me 3 months to complete. I had no idea if anyone would want them. I had no idea if I had any talent at all or just a desperate need to believe I did. The craft fair where I debuted was in a parking lot in Capitol Hill, surrounded by vendors selling handmade jewelry and artisanal candles. I set up a simple rack, hung my pieces, and waited terrified for the verdict. They sold out in 3 hours. I remember sitting in my car afterward counting the cash with shaking hands, unable to process what had happened. People had wanted what I made. Strangers had given me their money in exchange for something I had created. It was validation that went deeper than any praise my family had ever given me. Harper Atelier grew from there each year, building on the last. The small storefront, the first employee, the investor who believed in my vision when I could barely articulate it myself. The features in magazines, the celebrity clients, the gradual accumulation of success that felt simultaneously earned and miraculous. Through all of it, I kept my family at a distance. They knew I was doing something with fashion, but they never asked for details, and I never offered them. The separation felt necessary, protective, a way of maintaining the freedom I had fought so hard to achieve. But there was a cost to that separation, one I was only beginning to understand in the aftermath of the engagement party. By cutting my family off from my success, I had also cut them off from my pain. They had never seen me struggle through the early years. They had never witnessed the failures, the setbacks, the moments when I questioned whether any of it was worth the sacrifice. They saw only the polished result, the viral moment, when everything came together. Maybe that's why their reactions had been so hard to take. To them, my success must have seemed to come from nowhere, as though I had simply been hiding a winning lottery ticket all along. They didn't understand the years of work because they had never been there to see it. Standing in my office at Harper Atelier, surrounded by the evidence of everything I had built, I thought about that 15-year-old girl denied a summer program because the money was needed elsewhere. I thought about what I would tell her if I could reach back through time. You will be okay, more than okay. You will build something beautiful, and it will be yours. The people who should have believed in you never will, but you will find others who do. And one day, the girl who is never enough will become a woman who is more than enough, who is extraordinary, who is exactly who she was always meant to be. The memory made me cry, which has been happening a lot lately. But these tears felt different from the ones I had shed before. They felt like release rather than grief, like the slow loosening of something that had been clenched tight for far too long. I had spent so many years running from my past, from the pain of being overlooked, from the anger of being dismissed. Now finally, I was ready to stop running. Not because my family had changed, or because the viral moment had fixed anything, but because I had changed. I had proven to myself, if no one else, that my worth was not determined by their approval. That was enough. It had to be enough. 6 weeks after the engagement party, I flew back to California. Not for reconciliation, not exactly, but for something I had been putting off for too long, a conversation with Michael. He had agreed to meet me at a restaurant in Newport Beach, neutral territory, far from the Bennett estate, where everything had unraveled. I arrived early, choosing a table by the window where I could watch the ocean while I waited. The Pacific was gray that day, restless waves breaking against the shore in a rhythm that matched my uneasy heartbeat. Michael walked in 15 minutes late, looking rougher than I had ever seen him. The engagement party fallout had taken its toll. His hair was slightly unkempt, his suit less perfectly tailored than usual, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested sleepless nights. Emily. He sat down across from me without any other greeting. I wasn't sure you'd actually show. I said I would. Yeah, well. He flagged down a server and ordered a drink, something stronger than the wine I was nursing. A lot has happened since then. That was an understatement. The TikTok video had spawned endless discourse about family dynamics, sibling rivalry, and the way society undervalues women's contributions. Michael had become something of a villain in the court of public opinion, which, while satisfying in its way, had not been my intention. How's Olivia? I asked, not because I particularly cared, but because it seemed like the polite place to start. She's fine. The Bennetts are fine. Everyone's fine. His tone suggested the opposite. We've moved the wedding to a smaller venue, more private, to avoid another scene. Another scene, I repeated. Is that what you're calling it? Michael's jaw tightened. What would you call it? I would call it the natural consequence of publicly humiliating your sister in front of 200 people. I was joking. It was supposed to be a joke. Jokes are funny, Michael. What you did wasn't funny. It was cruel. He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. Whatever defense he had prepared was crumbling under the weight of 6 weeks of reflection and the thousands of comments calling him out for behavior that had seemed perfectly acceptable in the moment. I didn't think it would. He started again. I didn't realize how bad it sounded. Because you never thought about how your words affected me. You never have. None of you have. The server returned with his drink, buying us both a moment of silence. When she left, Michael took a long swallow before speaking again. Mom told me about her therapy, about the stuff she's been figuring out. He rotated his glass on the table, watching the liquid swirl. She said I was favored, that it wasn't fair to you. She's right. I know. The admission seemed to cost him something. I've been thinking about it a lot. The way things were growing up, the way I got everything handed to me while you had to fight for scraps. I never really saw it before. Or I saw it but didn't want to acknowledge what it meant. I waited, letting him work through whatever he was trying to say. I was a jerk. At the party, yeah, but before that too. For years, decades. He finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected: genuine remorse. I don't expect you to forgive me. I know that's not something I can ask for, but I wanted you to know that I see it now. What I did. What I was. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was closer to accountability than I had ever heard from my brother. I didn't know how to respond. Why did you ask to see me? Michael asked, when the silence had stretched too long. Because I'm tired, I said honestly. Tired of carrying around all this anger. Tired of defining myself by what you did or didn't give me. I came here because I needed to say some things to your face, not just through lawyers and media interviews. So say them. I took a breath, organizing the thoughts I had been rehearsing for weeks. You hurt me, not just at the party, but for my entire life. You were the favorite, and you used that position to make me feel small. Maybe you didn't mean to. Maybe it was just what came naturally when you were raised to believe you were more important, but the impact was the same. I spent years believing I was worthless, because that's how you and Mom and Dad treated me. Michael looked like he wanted to interrupt, but I held up my hand. I built Harper Atelier to prove you wrong. At first, anyway, I needed to succeed at something, anything, to show that I had value. But somewhere along the way, I realized the proving was never going to end. There was no amount of success that would make you suddenly respect me. So I stopped trying. I built for myself instead. And kept it a secret from us. Yes, because I knew exactly how you would react. You'd find some way to minimize it, to claim credit, to make it about you. I couldn't risk having the one thing that was truly mine contaminated by your judgment. Michael was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was subdued. I don't know how to fix this. What I did, what all of us did, I can't go back in time and change it. No, you can't. So what happens now? Are you cutting us off completely? Is that what this meeting is about? I had thought about that question countless times over the past weeks. There were moments when cutting off my family completely seemed like the only healthy choice, the clean break that would finally free me from their influence. But there were other moments when the idea of permanent estrangement felt like its own kind of failure, an admission that the damage was too deep to ever repair. I don't know, I said finally. I'm not ready to be a family again, not the way we were before, but I'm also not ready to say never. That's something, I guess. It's all I can offer right now. I finished my wine and signaled for the check. I'm going to set some boundaries going forward. No more family events where I'm treated like an outsider. No more jokes at my expense. If you want me in your life, you have to treat me with respect. Not because I'm successful, because I'm your sister. Okay, Michael nodded slowly. I can do that. I'll try to do that. Trying isn't enough. You have to actually do it. He met my eyes, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the brother I might have had, the relationship we might have built if things had been different. I will, he said. "I promise." Whether he would keep that promise remained to be seen. But as I walked out of the restaurant and into the gray California afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in years. I had said what I needed to say. The rest was up to him. The months that followed my confrontation with Michael were transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. With the weight of family drama beginning to lift, I had space to think about what I actually wanted from my life beyond the driven pursuit of success that had defined my 20s and early 30s. Harper Atelier continued to grow, fueled by the attention from the viral moment, but sustained by the quality of our designs and the strength of our team. I promoted Stacy to creative partner, acknowledging the role she had always played in the company's success. We hired new designers, expanded into accessories, and began discussions about international markets. But the growth I cared about most wasn't measured in revenue or expansion. It was the quiet work of building a life that felt genuinely my own. I started seeing a therapist, something I had resisted for years, convinced I could handle everything on my own. Dr. Martinez was a calm presence who asked questions I didn't want to answer and sat with me through the silences when I couldn't find words. She helped me understand that my drive for success had been in part a form of running away, of staying so busy I didn't have to sit with the pain of feeling unloved. "You've accomplished remarkable things," she said during one of our sessions, "but accomplishment isn't the same as fulfillment. What would fulfillment look like for you separate from proving anything to anyone?" It was a question I couldn't answer immediately. My entire life had been oriented around external validation, first seeking it from my family, then from the fashion industry, then from the millions of people who watched my viral moment. The idea of fulfillment that came from within, that didn't depend on others' approval, felt foreign and slightly terrifying. But I worked at it, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and breakthroughs that didn't follow any predictable pattern. I reconnected with old friends who had drifted away during my workaholic years. I started taking weekends off, not just working from home instead of the office. I explored hobbies I had abandoned decades ago, watercolor painting and hiking and cooking elaborate meals for one. And I began to think seriously about family, not the one I had been born into, but the one I might choose to build. Stacy had been my found family for years, the person who knew me better than anyone and loved me anyway. But our relationship was complicated by the professional dynamic, by the fact that she was also my employee, my creative partner, my business dependent. I needed other connections too, people who weren't tied to Harper Atelier, who knew me as Emily rather than as the founder and CEO. I joined a book club that met monthly at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill. I volunteered at a youth arts program mentoring teenagers who reminded me painfully of my younger self. I adopted a cat, a grumpy orange tabby named Rust, who demanded attention on his terms and tolerated mine. These small expansions of my life felt enormous. Each new connection, each hour spent doing something just because I enjoyed it, was a brick in the foundation of the person I was becoming. My mother and I continued our careful reconciliation. We had lunch once a month, conversations that started awkward and gradually became more natural. She was doing her own work in therapy, confronting patterns that went back generations, and sometimes she shared what she was learning with a vulnerability that still surprised me. "I was so afraid of you," she admitted during one of our lunches. "Your creativity, your independence. You were everything I had been told I couldn't be, and instead of celebrating that, I punished you for it." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, not unkindly. "Because you deserve to know it wasn't your fault. The way I treated you had nothing to do with who you were. It was about my own limitations, my own fears." It wasn't forgiveness what I felt in that moment. The wounds were too deep, the history too long for a single conversation to erase. But it was something like understanding, a recognition that my mother was a complicated person, shaped by her own painful experiences, not simply a villain in my story. Michael kept his promise mostly. He invited me to the smaller, more private wedding, and I attended without incident. Olivia was polite if not warm. The Bennetts were civil if not welcoming. I gave a toast that acknowledged the past without dwelling on it, and for one evening we managed to act like a functional family. Whether it would last, I couldn't say. Trust once broken is rebuilt slowly, if at all. But I was willing to try to extend the grace I was learning to give myself, even to people who had hurt me deeply. A year after the engagement party, I received an email from Time magazine. They were doing a follow-up piece on the women featured in their list, checking in on where they were now. Emily Harper's journey since her viral moment has been marked by both professional success and personal growth. The article would eventually read, Harper Atelier has expanded internationally with flagship stores in New York and Paris, complementing the Seattle headquarters. But Harper is quick to point out that her greatest accomplishments aren't measured in sales figures. I finally learned to stop running, she told Time. To stop trying to prove anything to anyone. Now, I'm just trying to build a life that feels like mine. Reading the final draft, I cried again. These were becoming tears of recognition, rather than grief acknowledgement of how far I had come, and gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. Home, I was beginning to understand, wasn't a place. It was a state of being, a sense of groundedness that came from knowing who you were and accepting it fully. I had spent my whole life searching for that feeling in external validation, in my family's approval and the recognition of strangers. Now finally, I was learning to find it within myself. Michael and Olivia's wedding, the grand event that had been planned for the Bennett estate, never happened. Not in the way it was originally envisioned anyway. The fallout from the engagement party had rippled outward in ways none of us anticipated. The TikTok video, viewed hundreds of millions of times by now, had become a cultural touchstone, referenced in articles about family dynamics, and used in training videos about workplace respect. The Bennetts, fiercely protective of their social standing, had been devastated by the association. I heard through my mother that the guest list had shrunk dramatically after the video went viral. Longtime family friends had declined with vague excuses about scheduling conflicts. Business associates had found reasons to distance themselves. Even the vendors who had been contracted for the event had become problematic, some requesting additional fees for the reputational risk of association. The final blow came from an unexpected source. One of Olivia's bridesmaids, a woman I had never met, had given an interview to a tabloid magazine detailing years of similar behavior from Michael and his family. Other stories had followed a cascade of anonymous accounts from former colleagues, ex-girlfriends, and distant relatives who had witnessed the Harper family dynamics and stayed silent until now. Michael called me on a Tuesday evening 3 months before the rescheduled wedding date. "It's off," he said without preamble. Olivia called it off. I wasn't sure what to say. Despite everything, despite the public humiliation and the years of dismissal, I found I didn't take pleasure in his pain. "I'm sorry," I said and meant it. "Are you—" His voice was bitter, but the edge faded quickly. "No, I know you are. That's the thing about you, Emily. You've always been the better person. I just never wanted to admit it." We talked for an hour that night, longer than we had ever talked as adults. He told me about the unraveling of his relationship, the way Olivia had grown increasingly distant as the public scrutiny intensified the argument that had finally ended things. "She said she couldn't marry someone who would treat family that way," Michael said. "If I could do that to my own sister, what would I do to her someday?" "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that I didn't have a good answer." It was the most honest conversation I had ever had with my brother. Stripped of his usual confidence, forced to reckon with the consequences of his actions, he seemed almost like a different person. Or maybe like the person he had always been underneath, hidden by years of privilege and enabling. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued, "at the restaurant, about how I used my position as the favorite to make you feel small. I keep going over my memories, trying to see what you saw, and—" He stopped, his voice catching. "I was awful, Emily. I was really, truly awful." "You were. I don't know how to make it right. I don't know if I can." "Maybe you can't," I said. "Maybe some things are too broken to fix completely, but you can be different going forward. You can choose to be the kind of person who doesn't treat people that way." "How do I do that? Seriously, how do I become someone different than who I've always been?" It was a genuine question, and I found myself thinking carefully before answering. "Therapy," I said finally. "That's where I started. Finding someone who can help you understand why you acted the way you did, what needs you were meeting through those behaviors. It's uncomfortable. It's painful. But it's the only way I know to actually change." Michael was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. "I'll try. I don't know if it'll work, but I'll try." The wedding cancellation became another media moment, though smaller than the original viral video. Some outlets framed it as karma, the natural consequence of Michael's cruelty catching up with him. Others took a more sympathetic view, noting that public shaming had its own costs, that the mob mentality of social media could destroy lives as easily as it created opportunities. I refused all requests for comment. The story wasn't mine to tell anymore. Whatever Michael was going through, he needed to go through it on his own terms, not filtered through my perspective for public consumption. My mother called a few days later, her voice thick with exhaustion. "He's a mess," she said. "I've never seen him like this. He actually asked me if we could go to therapy together. Family therapy." "What did you say?" I said yes. I said I would do anything if it meant we could finally be a real family. Not the performance we've been doing all these years. Something real. "That's good, Mom. That's really good." "Will you come to the therapy, I mean? Not right away. Michael isn't ready for that. But eventually. Would you consider it?" I thought about all the years of pain, the accumulated grievances that had defined our family for as long as I could remember. I thought about the work I had done on myself, the healing I was still in the process of achieving. And I thought about the future, the years stretching ahead that could be spent in estrangement or in the difficult, uncertain work of reconstruction. "Eventually," I said. "When the time is right, yes, I'll consider it." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even a commitment. But it was more than I would have been able to offer a year ago, and that felt like progress. The Harper family was broken, had always been broken in ways I was only beginning to fully understand. But broken things can sometimes be repaired given enough time and patience and willingness to do the work. Whether we would succeed remained to be seen. For now, it was enough to know we were finally trying. The invitation came on an autumn morning, crisp and official, embossed with the Time magazine logo. They were hosting an awards ceremony in New York, celebrating the women featured in their annual list, and they wanted me to speak. I almost said no. Public speaking had never been my strength, and the thought of standing on a stage before hundreds of people sharing something personal and meaningful made my stomach clench with anxiety. But Stacy convinced me to reconsider. "This is the culmination of everything," she said over coffee in my office, the Seattle skyline gray behind her. "Not the viral moment, not the drama. This is about what you've built and who you've become. You should tell that story." So I said yes and spent the next several weeks writing and rewriting a speech that never seemed quite right. Too bitter then, too sentimental, then too focused on the drama rather than the growth. I went through 11 drafts before settling on something that felt authentic. The night of the ceremony, I stood in the wings of the auditorium watching the other honorees take the stage. Women who had built companies and movements, who had changed policies and perspectives, who had succeeded against odds that should have been insurmountable. I belonged among them, I realized with a start. Not because of the viral moment, but because of everything that had come before and after. My name was called and I walked into the lights. The speech I gave that night would later be shared, widely quoted in articles and used in graduation ceremonies. But at the moment, I wasn't thinking about impact or virality. I was thinking about the 15-year-old girl who had been denied a summer art program, the 22-year-old who had moved to Seattle alone, the woman who had built an empire in secret because she had learned long ago not to expect celebration. I spent most of my life believing I wasn't enough. I said, my voice steady, despite the trembling in my hands. Not smart enough, not talented enough, not worthy of attention or investment. The people who should have believed in me didn't, and for a long time I let their judgment define my worth. The audience was silent, attentive. Last year, many of you saw a video of me at my brother's engagement party. You saw him call me old, broke, and ugly. You saw my family laugh along, and you saw what happened when the truth came out. That moment changed my life in ways I'm still processing. I paused, gathering my thoughts. But here's what I want you to understand. The success that was revealed that night didn't happen because of that moment. It happened despite years of being told I would never amount to anything. It happened because at some point I stopped waiting for permission to believe in myself. I stopped asking my family to see my value and started seeing it myself. The viral moment was satisfying. I won't lie about that. But it wasn't a victory. The victory was all the years before when I was building something real, something mine, without needing anyone's approval to keep going. I looked out at the audience, at the hundreds of faces watching me with expressions that ranged from sympathy to recognition. If you're listening to this and you're still waiting for someone to give you permission to pursue your dreams, stop waiting. If you're hoping that the people who should support you will finally come around, stop hoping. Not because they might not, but because your worth doesn't depend on their recognition. Build for yourself, create for yourself, succeed for yourself. And if the world eventually notices, wonderful. But if it doesn't, you will still have built something extraordinary. You will still have proven to the only person whose opinion truly matters that you were always enough. The applause started slowly and built into something overwhelming, a wave of sound that washed over me and made my eyes sting with tears. I had said what I needed to say, not for the audience, not for the cameras, but for the girl I used to be and the woman I was becoming. Backstage, I checked my phone and found a message from an unexpected source. My mother had been watching the live stream. "That was beautiful," she wrote. "I'm so proud of you. I know I don't deserve to say that after everything, but I wanted you to know." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I sat in the quiet of the green room, letting the emotions settle. Pride, yes. Relief, certainly. But also something like peace. A sense of completion that had nothing to do with my family's response and everything to do with my own journey. The girl who had been told she was nothing had become a woman who stood on national stages and spoke about self-worth. The sister who had been dismissed had built an empire. The daughter who had been overlooked had learned to see herself clearly, to value herself fully, to love herself unconditionally. That was the real victory. Everything else was just acknowledgement. A year after the Time speech, I stood in my office at Harper Atelier, watching the sunset paint the Seattle skyline in shades of amber and rose. The company had grown beyond anything I had imagined possible, with international presence and a team of designers who shared my vision for elegant, accessible fashion. But the view from this window, the daily reminder of how far I had come, never lost its power to move me. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother. We had settled into a rhythm of regular communication, not the close relationship I might have wanted in a different life, but something real and honest that had its own value. She was visiting Seattle next week, and we were planning to have dinner at a restaurant. I loved one that served the kind of food she never would have tried before her own journey of growth began. Michael had started therapy as promised. He was working through decades of entitlement and learning slowly to see others as complete human beings rather than reflections of his own importance. We talked occasionally, careful conversations that acknowledged the past without dwelling on it. I didn't know if we would ever be close, but we were, for the first time, genuinely trying. My father remained the most difficult. He had never apologized, never fully acknowledged the role he played in creating the family dysfunction that had shaped all of us. But my mother reported progress, small shifts in his perspective that suggested change was possible even for someone as entrenched as Richard Harper. I had learned to be patient, to accept progress where I found it and not demand transformation on my timeline. The work of healing was slow, non-linear, and often frustrating. But it was work worth doing. Stacy appeared in my doorway, knocking on the frame to get my attention. "Your 6 o'clock is here, the journalist from Vanity Fair." "Right, send her in." The interview was for a retrospective piece 1 year after the viral moment that had changed everything. I had agreed to it reluctantly, aware that the story was larger than my personal experience, but uncertain how to talk about it without getting lost in the drama all over again. The journalist was a woman about my age, professional and perceptive, with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she would see through any attempts at deflection. "I'm interested in what comes after," she said, once we had settled into the conversation. Everyone knows the viral story. What they don't know is how you've lived with it, what it's meant for you beyond the immediate impact. I thought about the question, really considered it before answering. I think the most important thing I've learned is that public vindication doesn't equal private healing. The video, the time feature, the attention, none of that fixed what was broken inside me. It just made it visible. What did fix it? Work, therapy, time, building relationships with people who see me clearly and love me anyway. Learning to be gentle with myself the way I've always been gentle with others. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. The viral moment was satisfying in the way revenge always is, but satisfaction fades. What's left is the work of building a life that isn't defined by the people who hurt you. That's harder than any business I've ever built. And it's more rewarding. The journalist scribbled notes, then looked up. Any regrets about how it all played out? I considered the question. There were moments I would have handled differently with the benefit of hindsight. The USB reveal, while effective, had been designed to humiliate as much as to inform. The speech at the Time Awards had been more confrontational than strictly necessary. I could have chosen reconciliation earlier, extended grace, before it was earned. But regrets suggested I would undo the choices if I could, and I wasn't sure that was true. The path I had walked, painful as it sometimes was, had led me here. To this office, this life, this hard-won peace with myself and my history. I regret that it was necessary, I said finally. I wish my family had been different. I wish I had been valued from the start. But I don't regret finding out who I was capable of becoming. After the journalist left, I stayed in my office watching the last light fade from the sky. Rust, my cat, had somehow materialized on the couch and was watching me with his usual expression of vague judgment. "We did okay," I told him. "Didn't we?" He blinked, which I chose to interpret as agreement. The truth was, I had done more than okay. I had built a life from the ruins of a childhood that should have broken me. I had turned dismissal into determination, pain into purpose. I had learned finally to love myself the way I had always deserved to be loved. That was the real story, beneath all the drama and viral moments and family confrontations. A woman who had been told she was nothing had proven to herself and to the world that she was everything she needed to be. If you're listening to this, if you're still carrying the weight of someone else's judgment, I want you to know something. Their opinion of you is not the truth. It's not even close to the truth. You have value that exists independent of anyone else's recognition. You have worth that no amount of dismissal can diminish. The path forward isn't easy. It requires courage to leave behind the people who should have loved you but didn't, even if only emotionally. It requires strength to build a new foundation when the original one was flawed. It requires patience, more patience than you think you have to do the slow work of healing. But it's possible. I am living proof that it's possible. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family? Have you ever felt invisible to the people who should have seen you most clearly? If so, I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments. Let others know they're not alone. And if this journey has moved you, if something in my story resonated with something in yours, I hope you'll stay for more. There are so many women out there who are rising from the ashes of families that failed them, building empires of their own, learning to love themselves in ways they were never taught. We're in this together, and together